A very good afternoon to another Lunch and Learn episode where we will be dealing today with the aspect, a very sensitive topic, dealing with the parental alienation and how to deal with parental alienation. Now, this is going to be a more of a legal perspective on parental alienation, and giving you some insight on understanding of what is parental alienation and how to deal with that specifically when it comes to maintenance matters. Hi, my name is Eugene Opperman. I'm a family law practitioner. I've been doing so for the past 23 years, specializing mostly in maintenance matters as well as matters of domestic violence and rights pertaining to children. Welcome to all our attendees, all our registrants from all over South Africa. Warm welcome to each and every one of you joining us today. So today we will be discussing parental alienation, and we will be exploring the possible definitions of what is parental alienation, and we'll also make some reference to what is parental alienation syndrome. We'll give you some understanding of the different types and the stages and the intensity of parental alienation, and referencing some case law that we have in South African law dealing specifically or mentioning parental alienation. We'll be addressing some misconceptions about what is parental alienation and what it is not, and giving you some understanding of the behaviors of the alienated child, the alienated parent, and as well as the rejected parent in context of parental alienation. And then briefly, we'll be discussing the ways to navigate parental alienation when it comes to maintenance matters. Just some logistics. You would have received a download link or a link via email if you've registered online, which is free on our website, www.lunchandlearn.org.za. If you have registered there, you would have received a link bringing you to the webinar, as well as giving you some insight on some pre-reading material, as well as, most importantly, like I always say, is the resource and templates folder, where you would get some additional information. You would obviously get the full course handout or the webinar handout together with all the slides. But we will also download or make available in that folder all the cases that we are referring to during these webinars, as well as some other additional information such as theses that I've read up, and all the details pertaining to parental alienation. Just as a matter of a disclaimer, parental alienation is a sensitive issue. It is a very complex and a unique issue, and a subject that is not lightly tread on in terms of the South African law and all over. If one looks at all the research done on parental alienation, as well as all the journals that have been written thereon, there's no formally universally accepted definition of what that is. And the purpose of this webinar would also be to give you some structure and some form how you can formulate a possible definition of what is and the understanding of parental alienation. It bears to note that I am an attorney and a mediator. I'm by no means a social worker or a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I do not portray to diagnose or to treat or to prove or to disprove that parental alienation or parental alienation syndrome does exist or not exist, but just to give you a general perspective on the legal side of what is parental alienation. So without further ado, and I think what is important to start off with is to see or to establish, where did it originate? Where did the term parental alienation originate from? And now the pseudo concept of parental alienation was coined in by a child psychiatrist called Dr. Richard Gardner. So he was well renowned working with sexual abuse cases, and he coined the term parental alienation syndrome, where he said that it was specifically caused by mothers who have led their children to believe that they have been abused by the fathers, and then raise allegations of sexual abuse against the father. And he recommended some draconian remedies of cutting off the parent in order to treat this form of parental alienation syndrome. Now, this syndrome, the parental alienation syndrome, was widely criticized by academics. It was also his peers, some of the other medical professions, psychiatrists, psychologists, for lack of empirical scientific evidence that it actually exists. Now, the parental alienation syndrome, and I'll be making reference about parental alienation as such, as a phenomena, as well as parental alienation syndrome. But the whole term, the pseudo concept of parental alienation syndrome, was dismissed by the medical and the psychiatric and the psychological associations. And actually in 2020, it was removed from the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, by the World Health Organization. Subsequently, during this whole course, and that was fueled on by a lot of men's rights, men's activist groups, parental alienation has gained considerable traction, and it has become a buzzword worldwide used specifically in with regards to negate allegations of domestic and sexual abuse. And it has been accepted on a global term. So I had to, as part of my research, I had to go and look, but where's the standing? Where's the definition? Where can we find some form of recognition of what is parental alienation or parental alienation syndrome? Like I mentioned, in 2020, it was removed from the ICD-11. So what is the ICD-11? Now, the ICD-11 is an international classification of diseases, and that serves to record and report health and health-related conditions globally. So if it is contained in the ICD-10 by the World Health Organization, it is recognized as a form of a disease or disorder or even a health condition, and that it truly exists. But the people at the World Health Organization thought that it is not necessary to include that in the latest ICD-11. And the reason for that is that they said it is not considered to be a healthcare term. It should rather be used as a legal term in the legal context, and it's generally used in context of the custody disputes during divorce or even after divorce or other partnership dissolutions. So it's not considered to be a psychological effect, but more in a legal context. And that was the reason why they actually removed it as a global disease or a health condition. However, if one looks at the ICD-11, because surely there should be some form of recognition of a parental alienation or any form or shape that it is contained in the record of diseases. The only reference that I could find was in the QE520, and that was dealing with the caregiver-child relationship problem, and it's actually called the caregiver-child relationship problem, where it says that there is a substantial and substantiated dissatisfaction within a caregiver-child relationship, including a parental relationship associated with significant disturbances in functioning. So at a long stretch, one could actually say that might also include the term parental alienation, but not as much the parental alienation syndrome. Now, in terms of South African law, and it's recognized worldwide, we have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, this is basically a textbook or a guidebook used by psychiatrists and psychologists, used by defining medical or mental conditions. Now, in the DSM-5, the latest DSM-5, there is no reference mentioned or made or mentioned even of specifically parental alienation as such as a mental condition. However, there was a new condition that was brought in, It is called the child affected by parental relationship distress, the CAPRD, child affected by parental relationship distress. So that is the only form of discord between a parent and a child that was contained in the DSM-5. Now, there's very little said about this new condition that was brought in. Safe to say that in the ambit thereof, in the elaborate explanation thereof, it mentions that this category should be used when the focus of clinical attention is in the negative effects of parental relationship discord. Now, that's usually then found in high conflicts, high levels of conflict, especially during divorces and acrimonious litigation proceedings, which causes distress and disparagement between a child in the family, and it would also then affect the child's mental and medical disorders. Quite recently, I sat in a week or so ago on the United Nations General Assembly seminar or webinar conference that they had by the Human Rights Council, where they specifically addressed the issue of parental alienation. And it was quite interesting because on the agenda point number 3, they discussed a special report dealing with domestic violence and how it actually intersects with the term of parental alienation. Now, some notes on the report. From the start, I should mention that this report was more seen from a domestic violence lens, but it does also impact on maintenance as such. The report states that the misuse of family law proceedings would actually perpetuate violence against victims. Even after divorce, post-divorce, it would severely impact the domestic violence aspect thereof, of specifically parental alienation as well. The report mentions that it is highly gendered and it is frequently used against mothers, and that it has a significant impact. And again, they make reference to specifically custody outcomes once the courts are requested to deal with specifically parental alienation. So that brings us to the question, but what is parental alienation? What, in our layman's terms, how do we understand it to be? And that would be our point of departure from here, leading on to the next portions of our webinar. And I have a couple of clips specifically from well-renowned people. And then there's one, Ray Thomas, that is actually a survivor of this whole parental alienation. Now, remember, we talk about the parental alienation and not the parental alienation syndrome. Now, if I can make a distinction, that parental alienation refers to the alienating by one parent using the child as a weapon against the other parent, whereas the parental alienation syndrome rather than refers to the symptoms shown by the child as a result of this alienating behavior. And there should be a distinction between parental alienation syndrome on the one side and parental alienation, just the general term, on the other side. But without further ado, I just want to, it's 2 very short clips, just explaining what they consider to be a definition, or how they could explain what parental alienation.
What exactly is parental alienation?
It's a family dynamic in which a child's been manipulated by one parent to reject the other parent who did nothing to deserve the rejection. It's a steady stream of negative messaging to the child that everything that other parent does is bad, wrong, stupid, contemptible, and an indication that the parent doesn't love the child.
Parental alienation is when a child is told that they have a good parent and a bad parent, and they are forced to choose and align themselves with the good parent. And the bad parent, everything that parent tries to do to be involved in their life, is looked at as bad and wrong. And typically we see this come to light at the time of divorce or a custody proceeding. And simply what happens is when there is anger and frustration and resentment, the child is used as a weapon against the other parent. And that other parent will turn the child against the other loving parent. They will tell them that they aren't good, they aren't loving, they don't want you, they don't want us, they abandoned us, they left us, they're trying to hurt us. And they will align themselves with the child that says, I am the parent you can depend on. I am the parent that you can love. I'm the only parent that loves you. That other parent does not love you, does not care about you. I'm the only one that you can depend on.
So this is quite an interesting take on in layman's terms, what is considered to be parental alienation. Now, like I said right in the beginning, at this stage, the whole pseudo concept of parental alienation is not commonly defined. There is no common acceptable clinical or scientific definition thereof. And I quite like Ray's example where he says that parental alienation is when one child is told that they have a good parent and then they have a bad parent, and then they have to choose between the two. And in South African terms, it's not difficult to understand that we do have that type of dynamics, specifically when it comes to high conflict divorces. We do have those type of family dynamics where the one parent is considered to be the good parent and the other one is considered to be the bad parent. Is that normal, and is that considered to be parental alienation? If one looks further at the definition, and that was mentioned by the UN as a leading authority, where they said that broadly speaking, parental alienation is understood to refer to the deliberate and the unintentional acts that cause unwarranted rejection by the child towards one of the parents, and it's usually the father. That was mentioned in passing by the UN. Now, if one looks at some of the writers, or the psychologists and the psychiatrists, the journals that they've written, contemporary pediatrics, they say that parental alienation is a pathological phenomenon. So here comes in, they still want to bring it in within the ambit of psychology. They say it's a pathological phenomenon in which a child is convinced by one parent that he or her other parent is unworthy and dangerous and should be rejected. The child is then convinced through a variety of tactics and maneuvers and ways and means by the alienating or the offending parent. And this is the crux of the matter. Now, if these maneuvers are successful, then the child develops the mental condition of parental alienation. And that could be defined in psychological terms as a form of a dis-ease or a discord when it comes to the caregiver and the parent and the child relationship. Now, in this research paper, they also mention that there is a distinction between mild, moderate, and severe forms of intensity of parental alienation. It's just not one blanket or one size fits all. There are actually 3 stages that you can go through: mild, moderate, and severe. Now, this was done by leading writers Bennett, Wumbold, and Narrow, where they distinguish between these 3 stages of parental alienation. And it's important to realize that it is not, like I said, it's not a one size fits all, and it actually ranges in intensity. If one looks at the mild form of parental alienation, in the mild form of parental alienation, the child then resists contact, but they actually enjoy the relationship once the parenting time is underway. So they would initially reject that. They don't want to go to the other parent, but once they are there, then they actually enjoy that. That is a mild form of parental alienation. There's some form of resistance, but it's not strong enough. Then one would turn to the moderate side, where the child would strongly resist contact and is constantly opposing just the whole idea of spending time with the other parent, or the bad parent, as we see it in this way. That is the moderate form thereof, where they strongly resist any form of contact. And then the severe one is where the child persistently and adamantly refuses to go to the other parent. They refuse contact. They do not want to spend time. They do not want to have any contact with that parent. And they would actually go as far as to run away or to hide rather than to spend time with the other parent. That is in the severe cases of parental alienation. It is also classified the types of alienators in parental alienation, the types of alienators. That is now considered to be the good parent, where they inflict this forms and stages of parental alienation towards the other parent using the child. So the naive one would be there's no serious intent. That is the naive type of alienator, where they do not have any serious intent to harm the child. So they still have the best interest of the child at heart. There's no serious intention to harm the child's relationship with the other parent, the so-called bad parent. And it often makes negative comments. They often make negative comments about the other parent. And that is usually found, the naive portion or the naive type of alienator is usually found in normal divorce cases. It is normal to express some dissatisfaction towards the person, but that does not necessarily mean that you are a parental alienator. It could be just seen as a form of naive type of alienator. Then you would get the active alienator. The active alienator spends some time. They intentionally criticize and they undermine the bad parent, the other parent that is being alienated. And they realize that their conduct is wrong. It is done with maliciously intent, and that it might potentially harm the relationship between the other parent and the child. So now they know about that, and that is the active type of alienator. Then lastly, we come to the one that is quite severe, and that is the obsessive alienator. Now, this is the alienator that spends time, effort, all the attention of intentionally working relentlessly to destroy the child's relationship with the other bad parent. And we do see that in the South African context as well. And it's usually as they are convinced about their righteousness of their actions. So they would find justification of each and everything that they do, that it is in the best interest of the child, although it might not be that. But they intentionally work relentlessly day and night, and they will spend so much time on bad mouthing and putting the other parent down, that it could actually be detriment to their own health and their own mental well-being. Now, if one looks at the South African legislation when it comes to parental alienation, there was one case that I want to refer to, and that's the Solar case that was handed down in 2003. One should note that this was done before the Children's Act came into play. And there was a couple of discussions, there was talk, and it was really a case of parental alienation, as a textbook classification would say, dealing with parental alienation between the acrimonious parties in a divorce matter. The family advocate was also involved because they act as the mediator or the neutral party representing the children. And it was also the task of the family advocate to present the wishes of the child to court, applying obviously adult insight and legal knowledge to the wishes of the child, and just not saying, this is what the child wants, without giving some form of justification and applying legal insight there too. So what had happened in this Solar case, which was quite interesting, the child did not want to have anything to do with the bad parent. It was evident through evidence that was led that the child parroted the good parent to a T. Everything that the good parent said, it was mimicked, and it was parroted by the child. Obviously, the child did not want to spend any time with the bad parent, and the beliefs that came out through testimony, as well as some psychological reports, that the beliefs of the child was so enmeshed, it was so intertwined with the so-called good parent, that he was actually not even intimidated. The child was not even remotely intimidated by the court or the court proceedings when they had to testify and they had to listen to the voice of the child, because the child was so caught up with a good parent's beliefs and the feeling of empowerment by the good parent that there was actually no way that any form of authority or even a court could intimidate them. And this could be a very concerning situation where a child is not even scared of court. Then I fail to see how such a thing like parental alienation in this matter, for example, would be successfully mediated if there is absolutely no remorse. There's no feeling of guilt towards the bad parent, because it is so enmeshed and the child shares so much so being indoctrinated and let's call it brainwashed, if I can use that term, that they share the causes of the good parent. So there are case legislation, case law in South African law that deals specifically with parental alienation. Strange enough, the word or the term parental alienation syndrome was never used, but they only made reference to the wording of parental alienation. Another case that is quite interesting, and I'm not going to run through all the cases because there are quite a few, is the V versus L case, which is quite a recent case that was handed down in 2022, where the application evolved around parental responsibilities and rights of the applicant and the respondent, and then their two minor children. And obviously there was allegations of parental alienation. And the judge then referred to the concept of parental alienation as a psychological manipulation of a child into demonstrating unwarranted fear, disrespect, and hatred, whereby one parent employs tactics such as criticizing the other parent and to stop the child from having any other contact with the so-called bad parent. So there was reference made to the psychological term of parental alienation in the V versus L case in 2022. The appellate division in T versus M also made reference thereto in 1997, where they acknowledged the dangers of parental alienation. Staying with the V versus L case, the matter there in 2022, the judge was of the view that parental alienation is a complex issue, and that they believe that the acting it is not in the interest of the best interest of the child. And the judge there mentioned that the most common example of parental alienation is when a parent refuses or frustrates the other parent's exercise to contact with a minor child. So once again, we come back to a portion called parental responsibilities and rights, the visitation rights that are curtailed by using these methods of parental alienation as a form of punishment towards the other parent. Last case, State versus Daniel Makibi. That's also 2022 case. This was a quite interesting case because there the task and the scope of the scope of duties of the family advocate was placed under a magnifying glass, where the allegation was made that the family advocate did not have the necessary expertise to deal with these type of matters, because they are legal practitioners specializing in the rights of children, and they are not necessarily psychologists. In this case, the child was only 4 years old when the mother claimed, or the father claimed, that there was parental alienation. And the judge looked at it holistically and said that, you know what, it is actually just an acrimonious relationship, and that the parents may have been using the wrong approach in dealing in the ways that they deal on how to communicate with one another, and that there is no talk of parental alienation. A couple of other cases, and I'm not going to make reference, we'll go into that with detail. There's basically two cases the top one there, PMN, and the OM cases, and those cases mostly deal with international and interprovincial relocations, where the term parental alienation came forth in the court documents. So, does parental alienation exist? Because we said that, and just an amplification of what was said, the definition was not even included in the ICD-11, and there is no universally accepted term. So where does it come from? Is it still there? Should we disregard that? Where does it come from? Specifically, we know that parental alienation syndrome has been left out of most of the documents, specifically the DSM-5. So does it really exist? In the next two clips, these are all renowned speakers, people that know that they are knowledgeable about this subject, just giving us some more insight on does it actually really exist?
Not everyone recognizes it. Not everyone recognizes it. And recognize has at least two meanings. It could mean to recognize it existing at all, or it could mean to recognize it in a given case, right? So the problem is you've got both of those issues. For the people who don't recognize that it exists, I think it's so clear that it does exist that that's not a legitimate position. All the word means, alienation or parental alienation, is that a child has resisted contact with a parent or rejected a parent for no legitimate reason, and usually the definition includes as a result of undue influence. So when you say you don't believe in parental alienation, you're saying the equivalent of I don't believe that any parent ever undermines the other parent with a child. In terms of recognizing it in a given family or child, here again I want to clarify the terms. The parental alienation can mean a bunch of things. It could be a family dynamic, which involves at least three people. It could be the behavior of a parent, an alienating parent, or it could be the result of that behavior in a child, an alienated child. So anyone who's looking to identify it needs to look at the big picture and to consider all three corners of a triangle.
Now, part of the problem here is that in the 1980s, there was this idea of parental alienation syndrome proposed by a man named Dr. Richard Gardner. He really took the theory too far, and it wasn't supported by any scientific evidence. Now, some people equate the idea of this syndrome to just plain parental alienation. The syndrome, of course, is not well supported, but the idea of parental alienation is. So one is a proposed mental disorder that was essentially debunked, and the other is simply a behavior. We know that parental alienation can occur and does occur fairly regularly in these custody disputes. These professionals are denying the reality of manipulation. Another example of the professional community not being aware of the presence and power of narcissism. They seem to be willing to believe that narcissism exists on the side of somebody alleging parental alienation, but they don't believe that if somebody's accused of it, they could be narcissistic or deceptive. Fortunately, this group of professionals is fairly small. The vast majority of mental health professionals and lawyers agree that a parent can manipulate a child into rejecting the other parent when the other parent did not deserve to be rejected or would not have ordinarily been rejected if not for the first parent's interference.
Very interesting views of two renowned speakers dealing specifically with parental alienation. And the crux of the last speaker was actually very good, because in terms of South African law, and he made mention to the manipulative behavior of parents, and that would fall under the ambit closely under domestic violence. Now, there's two provisions of domestic violence that's quite important here. Obviously, it's controlling and coercive behavior of the one parent against the other parent, and that would amount to an act of domestic violence. But most importantly, in the new amendments that came into effect in April this year, was exposure of a child to domestic violence and the effects of domestic violence. And surely, if one alleges parental alienation in some shape or form, that the Domestic Violence Act could also come into play, specifically talking about the coercive and controlling behavior of the child rejecting the parent as a result of influence, undue influence by one parent, the proposed good parent that puts down the bad parent. So that is in context. And for us as legal professionals, as mediators, as social workers, and even just the general public wanting to know more about that, it is important to see, to recognize some forms of behaviors. What are the behaviors that one needs to look out for when it comes to parental alienation? Now, in the next couple of slides, we'll be dealing with specifically the view from the child, and this was done by a research paper, Children Who Resist Post-Separation Parental Contact, and that was done by Fidlet Bala and Sani in 2013. So, just from the views of a child, there are lists and lists that they recognize, and they can say these are the type of symptoms that one needs to look out for. And it's quite interesting that the child then, the gist of it is that the child shows very little remorse for the cruel treatment towards the other parent, and it actually sees the one parent as the good parent and then the other parent as the bad parent. And during the disputes between the parent, the child is then always in a position to choose sides. The child also makes use of words and phrases typically used by the alienating parenting. Therefore, just like we saw in the Solar case, it basically parrots and it mimics the words of the one parent. These are, I'm not going through all of these. These are some of the views of the child, how the child would experience that parental alienation. Very importantly is that there's no guilt or ambivalence regarding the malicious treatment and hatred. Very interestingly is that there could also be hatred by association, where they extend the hatred to extended family or even pets. They don't like the other parent's pets because I don't like the parent, and so forth. So if one in a situation, in a legal situation, or even in a mediation situation, if these type of words and statements come to the fore, then one should realize that the red flag of a possible parental alienation should be investigated and to look into a little bit more further. From the other side, from the parental alienation from the good parent's view, that is now the one that is proposed to be the one that is doing the alienation. And that is, and I want to spend some time on this because this is the behavior that we see most often in practice. And that is usually when the child insists, or the parent insists that the child has the right to make decisions about contact. Specifically dealing now with visitation rights and care and contact, that the child is brought into the realm of adulthood, and it is expected that the child needs to make informed decision as if they were an adult. The good parent then would very rarely talk about the other parent. They are uninterested, and they're not interested with the child time that they spend with other parent, and they would actually give them the cold shoulder and the silent treatment when they come back from the other parent visitation, when they spend some parenting time there, and they would express some dissatisfaction about the contact. They would just say, you know what, I don't agree and I don't like it when you go to the father. Usually what happens is that all the photos of the bad parent is removed, and all the reminders, all the gifts and so forth would also be removed. Interestingly enough, we also found in practice that many of the telephone messages and the gifts from the other parent is also destroyed or ignored or never given to the child as a form of punishment. Wrongly, the child is being drawn into what has happened in terms of litigation. The child is made part of the litigation process and the discussions between adults of litigation. And I sincerely have a problem with that, because then a child is forced to make decisions as if they were adults. and the only frame of reference that they would have is the good parent that they stay with, or is the custodial parent or the primary caregiver, and they mimic that that form of behavior. Other symptoms that one could look forward or look out for is that the good parent is convinced that there might be harm even if there is no evidence, and there might actually be false or fabricated allegations of sexual, physical, even emotional abuse. Even if that abuse is not true, it might be still in the mind of the good parent, and they verbalize that. The parent then often say is that, you know what, the other parent left us, they divorced us, they do not love us. So it over involves the child in adult matters and litigation, which is quite problematic. The child is also required to keep secrets and to spy, and actually to report back once they come back from the other parent. And there is absolutely an extreme lack of courtesy to the rejected parent and respect of the parenting time of the purported bad parent. So from the bad parent's view, now this is now the parent that is on the receiving end of the alienation. Usually that goes with harsh, rigid, and punitive parenting style. There might be some outrage at the child, challenging his or her authority. Obviously, the biggest problem that we see here is the counter-rejection behavior of this parent, where the parent would simply say that, you know what, the child rejects me, so I will reject the child, which is then just becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of detriment, and it's definitely not in the best interest of the child. There might also be some attempts to induce some guilt, forcing the child to reassert parental visitation and so forth. And very often this behavior would go together with some rage or blame towards the alienating parent for brainwashing the child, and taking no responsibility in helping the parental or salvaging the parental relationship between the child and the alienated parent. So in short, I can mention that parental alienation does exist. It is true. It is. I've seen it. I've argued that in court, and surely it does exist. Although there's no scientific evidence, no formal definition of parental alienation syndrome per se, the effects that it might have on the child, I firmly believe that there might be an intersect of parental alienation, if we want to use that term, intersect with domestic violence, where there is exposure of these type of acts of domestic violence, the coercive, the controlling, even the verbal abuse, where the child is exposed thereto. And then most definitely the Domestic Violence Act would come to your rescue and would be your remedy in these type of cases as well. So what is parental alienation not? What is it not? Because we've seen what it might be and what behaviors there might be, but what is it not? Number one, the mere restriction of contact of one parent of the other is not considered to be parental alienation. In some instances, it may be seen as the whole parental alienation strategy, but on its own, where you just keep the visitation rights from the other parent, is not considered to be parental alienation. Failure to submit contact as per court order. If you have a care and contact order issued by the court and the one party refuses the care and contact, that is not seen as parental alienation. That should rather be seen as contempt of court, because there is a valid court order that the court ordered, and it is not considered to be parental alienation. Parental estrangement is also found. That's also one of the aspects what parental alienation is not. And that is usually when there is a reasonable basis or reasonable ground that there might be for the child to be adverse to contact, that the child do not want to go to the other parent. And that might be in the form, or the reason for that might be domestic abuse. It could be substance abuse, where they do not want to go to the other parent's property or the house, or do not want to spend time with that parent because of domestic violence, verbal abuse, and so forth. So that would be parental estrangement, and that would not necessarily mean that it is parental alienation. It could form part of the parental alienation strategy, but most often it is just considered to be a parental estrangement, but not parental alienation. The next one would be loyalty conflict, where there is an acrimonious divorce, acrimonious relationship between the parties, and the child is then in the middle thereof. And then the child needs to choose, and they feel divided with regards to loyalty between the two parents. The last one that I want to address is gatekeeping. Now, gatekeeping is also a new term that is also a buzzword doing the rounds, and that is where one parent restricts access of the other parent and act as a gatekeeper, keeping the child away from the other parent. Now, that is per se in itself, gatekeeping in itself is not considered to be parental alienation, although it might form part of a alienating strategy, but on its own, it is not regarded as parental alienation. There might also be necessary reasons for gatekeeping, and that, like I mentioned in parental estrangement, it could be substance abuse and it could be domestic violence as well. So those are the in short what parental alienation is not. And this was slides from Mervyn Vermeulen's webinar on parental alienation earlier this year. Thank you, Mervyn, for that. So if one looks at navigating parental alienation in the broader sense. Now, first of all, one should realize that the behavior of parental alienation is controversial, and it is very complex, and it's very sensitive, and it is dealt with by the courts. Now, the term parental alienation should not be used lightly and without psychological foundation. Leave the diagnosis to the experts. We are so easy to label a partner as a parental alienator without any form of justification on a psychological grounds whatsoever. So please be careful that you do not use the term very lightly, that only unless there is a formal diagnosis of parental alienation, you can use that term. But other than that, you might find yourself in some warm water if you just loosely use the term and label the other party as a parental alienator. Realize that parental alienation, or the behavior of parental alienation, is real. It does exist, although the syndrome might not be recognized, but the whole idea, the whole concept of parental alienation, by lack of a better word, does really exist. There's a word of caution to the attorneys and the mediators and the social workers. Once you deal with these type of things in a mediation session or a legal consultation, or even a social work interview, that you do not attempt any therapeutic interventions if you are not qualified to do so. For us as attorneys, we would love to give information, and not only information, legal advice, but also to steer the parties in the right direction. But if stay in your lane, if you do not have the legal expertise to deal specifically with, for example, the voice of the child, or to all those type of therapeutic interventions, please do not try and attempt it if you are not qualified to do so. There is a term called signposting. If you feel that therapy might be necessary, that you actually refer them to a knowledgeable person that deals specifically with those type of instances. Bringing it back to maintenance courts. Now, maintenance courts very seldomly deal with alienation matters, as it speaks usually to the parental responsibilities and rights, and more specifically of visitation and international relocations as well. So it's not dealt very often in the maintenance realm, although I've sat in a number of Section 6 and Section 10 inquiries where the term is used, And it is mentioned in testimony that, you know what, this is the reason why I withhold maintenance, because I'm being withheld visitation and the child is being alienated. It is not up to the maintenance court to decide on that matters. That is usually done then either by the children's court or the high court, where the children is considered to be the upper guardian, or the court is considered to be the upper guardian of the court. So it's not dealt with much in the maintenance setting. To end off, one should realize that parental alienation is a behavior. It is not necessarily a syndrome. It is not an illness. It's not a diagnosed mental disorder per se, but the behavior is very much real, and we see that in practice, and the effects thereof on children and on both parents. It does have long-lasting effects, most definitely on the children, as well as both of the parents. Now, although the term parental alienation is not properly defined, we still use the behavior thereof, and that we can bring in the realm of the domestic violence field, where we focus on the coercive and the controlling behavior of one parent towards the other parent. And if that is so severe, then it just very well might form the basis of an act of domestic violence. Read with that then also the new act of domestic violence that was brought in, namely the exposure of a child to domestic violence or the effects of domestic violence. Then most definitely the term parental alienation could definitely be seen more popping up in domestic violence matters. That was basically just our rundown on what parental alienation is, and that is more from a legal perspective than a psychological or psychiatric viewpoint. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Eugene Opperman. I'm a family law practitioner specializing in maintenance matters, as well as domestic violence and the rights pertaining to children. And I've got a keen interest in the parental alienation. If you want to share some of your stories regarding parental alienation, we are busy compiling an ebook specifically on parental alienation. That you're most welcome to reach out to us. Send us your story and some of your comments. Send it to info@lunchandlearn.org.za. We would love to hear from you, and then compile your stories. Obviously, it would be anonymously, because we are not allowed by law to divulge the names of the children and so forth, but we could definitely make mention thereof in certain ways. So if you're comfortable there with that and you want to reach out to us, even if you need to have some more information regarding parental alienation from a legal perspective, you're most welcome to drop us a mail at info@lunchandlearn.org.za. Thank you so much for joining us today, all the registrants. I see that we also have quite a number of people joining us from all over South Africa, and if I look at the dashboard, quite a lot of people, social workers, mediators, a lot. Thank you for joining us. We'll be seeing you next week, same time, same place, for another Lunch and Learn episode. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon further.